Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, October 27th, 2025, that the committee is commencing its study of the 2025 reports of the Auditor General of Canada, follow-up on programs for First Nations. So we're going to have two panels, the Minister, and then after we'll have the Auditor General. And then I just need a little bit of time at the end to provide some instructions to the analysts and the clerk from the committee of what we heard and what we want them to work on over the holidays. So I will, about 10, 15 minutes before the end, I'm going to suspend, and then we will go into the drafting instructions. So without further ado, appearing today from 4:30 to 5:30, the Honourable Mandy Gull-Masti, Minister of Indigenous Services. Welcome, Minister. I'm glad to have you here. As well, from the Department of Indigenous Services, we have Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister, Candace St-Aubin, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Health and Social. We have Paula, hi, and Hannon Yokel, okay, close, Assistant Deputy Minister, Regional Operations Sector. Jennifer Wheatley, Assistant Deputy Minister, First Nation and Inuit Health Branch, welcome. And we're all here, so that's great. Minister, you're going to have 5 minutes, please.
Okay, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, the day has been quite long. My translation of Cree says, hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Last time translation was not provided, I think, when I spoke in Cree. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come back. I welcome the Auditor General's follow-up report on programs for First Nations and Inuit, and along with that, the feedback directly from community that guides our ongoing effort and commitment to ensure that we are continuously striving to improve delivery of services. The Auditor General's message to us was direct. There is progress since the earlier audits, and there was an additional message that was very clear to us, that there are places where our progress must go faster, must be clearer, and be more accountable. That's what a follow-up is. It is a measure to ensure that you are looking and seeking to follow the progress that you are making. We also are looking to measure what has changed and to name what hasn't and to understand why, and also focus on what our next steps are. My department and I will soon present an action plan that will lay out the next steps that we are going to undertake, shaped by what we've also heard from communities who are a valuable part of this conversation. I carry this responsibility with care, and I'm looking forward to that work that will be presented in spring of 2026. As a First Nations woman, I can say that I can attest directly to the impact of services and the impact that they have when they fail to provide a proper service. I've also seen the difference when a community or service is well prepared. I know directly from personal history living in a remote community what it means when there is a nurse that delivers that service with care and compassion, and what it also means when that nurse is able to deliver it in your mother tongue. I know that listening to our leaders is a critical part of that, and being rooted in an approach that's based on culture is something that is very significant and necessary to ensure proper health care. Let me share some of the work that we've already done, beginning in health services. Working with First Nations partners, we've taken steps to bring care closer to home. I think this is absolutely imperative. This also includes expanding eligible services to have providers of paramedics, licensed practical nurses, and nurse practitioners, and to also improve the ways that we hire and retain health workers in the communities that need them the most. We have also included the hiring of over 100 new frontline nurses and those nurses are often working in remote and isolated communities. What does this mean? It means more consistent primary care, better after-hours support, and most importantly, fewer trips far away from family to receive that basic service. We are improving dental care delivery with 2.8 million dental claims provided for First Nations and Inuit last year. That number represents real people who have accessed a broad range of dental services from prevention to fillings across Canada and across the span of their life. On investit aussi dans les solutions dirigées.
We're also investing in First Nations-led solutions. On the 12th of September, at the Whitecap Dakota Nation, I was fortunate enough to join the community and partners to put the first shovel in the ground for the building of a new virtual health centre, the first of its kind in Canada. Supported by over $28 million in federal funding, this is an innovative project and it will be Indigenous-led and will connect up to 90 remote communities in Saskatchewan for health services delivered in the community.
The OAG reported that Indigenous Services Canada adapted quickly to providing personal protective equipment to Indigenous communities and organizations when other sources were not available. At Indigenous Services Canada, we also streamlined ways to bring nurses and paramedics in, especially responding to communities when they were in their most vulnerable time, often having members that had very complex health needs. We were able to provide that support during a critical period of time. Depuis cet audit, nous avons aussi amélioré.
Since that audit, we've improved the way in which we send resources to where they are most needed, including being able to quickly deploy staff and supplies when communities need them. This is a critical approach. And today in Indigenous Services Canada, we're consistently responding to 100% of PPE requests for health services in the communities.
Everybody here knows that this was one of the most devastating wildfire seasons in history. I want to thank community leaders, elders, firefighters, and those who fought in the front line to keep communities safe. On the audit on emergency management in First Nations communities, they asked for clarity before fire and flood seasons, agreements, role, logistics, funding, and timely support during and after events. With investment in prevention and mitigation, we have seen since the 2022 audit, Indigenous Services Canada developed a comprehensive action plan with implemented targeted measures across all recommendations to strengthen preparedness, coordination, and accountability. The department remains on track to meet all of the associated timelines, including the development of new multilateral agreements in collaboration with First Nations and provinces. There are currently 8 bilateral emergency management agreements in place and 7 wildfire agreements. We are supporting over 300 emergency management coordination positions across the country. On va continuer de travailler avec les...
We will continue to work with communities and also to draw on and include Indigenous knowledge to protect lives, strengthen community resilience, and reduce the impact of emergencies.
Clean, safe drinking water for First Nations is a top priority for this government and for myself personally. We are funding operations and maintenance for existing systems and supporting First Nations in new infrastructure builds. Since 2015, we've seen sustained progress. We've committed over $7 billion to support First Nations for on-reserve water and wastewater infrastructure and operations and maintenance, including over $5 billion to support 1,545 water and wastewater projects that will benefit 595 communities, serving approximately 481,000 people. 725 of these projects are completed to date. The results have been clear. We were able to lift 149 long-term drinking water advisories, providing access to clean water for 9,289 homes and 655 buildings, and further prevent 310 short-term water advisories from becoming long-term. Based on 2023-2024 performance inspections, 97.5% of public water systems on reserve produce treated water that meets the prescribed standards and the guidelines for Canadian drinking water quality. But, as the Auditor General also pointed out, there's still work left to do. In every community with a long-term drinking water advisory, there is a plan in place, and there is work underway with the community to work towards lifting it. I'm committed to advancing this work while making sure that we not only accelerate process, that we are demonstrating progress.
Thank you.
By spring-
If we can get you just to wrap up a little bit, we'll get to questions and you'll be able to get more out.
Okay, thank you. By spring, we intend to introduce legislation on clean drinking water. Very excited to see that come to the table. We are also, addressing that while there has been much work done and there's been a lot of information provided in these audits, there continues to be progress. Meeting communities in the places that they are is an important part of that progress. We are looking to press forward to work together. We understand that there is urgency, but we must also demonstrate respect and transparency for the families that we serve. Today, we do accept these findings. We know that they are a measure and a guideline. We recognize that there is work that remains, and we are committed to the path ahead. It's essential that our services are delivered in ways that honor culture, dignity, self-determination, and progress for the community in community. Merci.
So we're going to go to our first round of questions, and for 6 minutes, MP Morin, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for sharing your time with us today. I want to acknowledge you again as the first Indigenous ISC Minister. I can only try to understand on the difficulties it is of being Indigenous and trying to overcome the challenges of the ministry itself. That said, we still have a challenge before us and you have much work to do. Reflecting on these reports, Minister, of course, you acknowledge some level of progress, but according to the reports, ISC budgets have increased 84%, but over half of these recommendations still go unanswered. You just mentioned water, of course, is one of the reports that we're talking about today, and you're introducing clean water legislation in the spring. You've made that commitment. The government has also made a commitment to the United Nations Declaration and free and prior informed consent. Can you answer a question in terms of if one First Nation doesn't agree to your water legislation, is that honoring free and prior informed consent?
Thank you, MP Morin. It's a pleasure to work with you. It's a pleasure to spend this time with you, not only as elected officials in this House, but also as former Grand Chiefs of our nation. I think that this is progress for young Indigenous youth that are looking towards us. The work that has been done with regards to water has been quite significant. I want to acknowledge that those groups that I met with at the Assembly of First Nations last week were very clear. They wanted to see legislation on the table. We know that there are over 640 different Indigenous nations, communities across the country, many nations, all with their own individual relationship with water. I think we also have to speak to the fact that there is a history of trauma also associated with water. When you are not able to access clean drinking water, that really does have an impact on your relationship with that service when it comes into play in community. In terms of UNDRIP, I'm very honored to be part of the nation that helped draft the outline of UNDRIP and contributed. Many leaders in my nation contributed to that. When you're looking to speak to free and prior informed consent and what UNDRIP is seeking to do, it's about ensuring that you are contributing to the process. And I think that the work that's been immense in drafting the water legislation is going to be great progress. There's always room for improvement. I think that applies to legislation too. When we see space for something or when we have not addressed a component or overlooked a component, we as government have to respond to that. And I think that it is in these tables that we will hear testimony for, what reshaping legislation could look like or what legislation speaks to today. I
only got so much time, so I
Sure.
apologize, thank you. But if one nation is against your legislation, because there were several in the previous iteration of this legislation, is that a violation of free, prior, and informed consent?
That's a great question, Billy. Oh, sorry, not to be so informal. MP Morin. I think that when one nation is expressing that they're not happy with something or they feel that something was missed for them, you have to do the work of really understanding what it is that concerns them, what it is that they want to have addressed.
But is it yes or no? Like, is it a violation of free, prior, and informed consent if they disagree with the water legislation?
I can't speak for them. They would have to determine
But
that.
it's your legislation.
It's not government's place to interpret if I have violated their free, prior and informed consent. They should make the statement.
If they
should
say
tell me as government. And I'm always here like open and willing to work with them to meet what it is that they do not deem satisfactory in that process.
If the nation said you violated our free, prior, and informed consent with this legislation, would you agree with them?
I would agree to work with them and making sure that whatever they don't feel has been met or is unsatisfactory, that I'm creating that space to address them. Because that's what I believe. I believe that if you're going to work with government, if you're going to come to the table and have an expectation of something and how you wish to be served, it should be individualized. It should respond right down to the nation level or even the community level if necessary, because we have to offer a quality service. We have to offer programs that align with what communities are feeling. So if there is a group that is coming forward and they wish to express that, you know, this is their position, I'm there to respond to them and support them with what they need.
Your refusal to define free, prior, and informed consent to avoid ever being held to it.
No, it is not.
So you will be held to free, prior, and informed consent on water legislation.
What the government has put forward as legislation has been defined with community, a lot of contribution with community. I want to acknowledge that work. I want to acknowledge everybody who came to the table. And I want to acknowledge also that last week during sessions at the Assembly, I heard from many leaders across the country that were pleased with where things were at the legislation, but many also expressed to me that more needs to be done. It is not my position to determine if government has violated somebody's position of free, prior, and informed consent.
One more
I want
question.
to be
25
respectful
seconds.
of that.
The public safety minister refuses to enact essential declaring policing legislation. These reports still show the factor that communities are in crisis. There's 20 crises declared this summer. I can name them off. Are you in agreement with declaring First Nations policing essential, and will you get that done as the Indigenous Services Minister in Cabinet?
I've
Yes
had
or
a
no?
lot of really great conversations with Minister Angren Sari. I'm butchering his name. I think that, you know, we've heard a lot of things across the country. I myself had heard of many of the instances. There needs to be that support in community. What does that look like? They need to define it for themselves.
Thank you
for
very
some
much. We're
places.
going to have to move on to Parliamentary Secretary Lavac, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre, d'être président.
Thank you, Madam Minister, for being with us today at the committee. My first question for you is vis-à-vis the Auditor General, who said that there's 4 systemic barriers to progress, namely the continuity of management or sustained management, clarity of service, defining and reinforcing capacity, and a silo approach. So what measures are you taking in your department to overcome these barriers in a coordinated way? Thank you for that question. In terms of what I've seen when I was introduced to this file, I saw that there was a big request from nations, namely to have a service that's based with a one-window service approach. And so I was proud to work on that with my Deputy Minister to determine the right process to make changes to Indigenous Services Canada so we can deliver that type of approach. And I'm also proud of the fact that within the government there was a mandate for all of the ministers around the Cabinet to take a whole-of-government approach to work on these files related to Indigenous peoples. It's not just for the work that's carried out in my department, but rather the Prime Minister has given this directive, this mandate, to make sure that we all work together to deliver on these services. And I'll turn to the Deputy Minister to see if she'd like to add anything.
Covered, thanks.
pour continuer sur ce sujet-là,
So to
d'abord,
continue
parlons un
on
petit peu
this
de la...
subject, let's talk about the question of emergency management, because there's questions that have come up, as you've already said, that there was the last wildfire season. It was a very significant season in terms of fires, and the frequency is really going up a great deal. So how is ISK collaborating with provinces and the leaders of First Nations to reinforce this? And what are you doing together with Minister Olszewski to see how we're actually addressing the real challenges on the ground? Thank you for that question. I've worked a great deal with my colleague, Minister Olszewski, because we've seen that the wildfire season was a very intense one. We did several things. We have worked with over 300 coordinators dealing with emergencies in the communities. That was a big support for us. And we also worked with several nations and several provinces at different levels of emergencies. But it's still work in progress. Together with Minister Olszewski, I was able to participate at our FPT table, the Federal, Provincial and Territorial table, to look at the link between the provincial and the federal level and then the communities. And we've seen that there's a great deal of work to be done still on this aspect. We were able to achieve a certain number of agreements with the provinces, but there's still some work to be done in other provinces because there's a different approach being taken in different places, and we have to make sure that we can deliver a service and create an agreement that's based in their community reality and that it also reflects their relationship with the provincial government level. We're working on this to make progress. We've had many successes already, but we also know it's not just these two groups that need to play a role in this process. There's also public safety, who can come forward when there's emergencies. There's various partnerships involved, but there needs to be a framework, a clear framework agreement that defines the roles with the processes specified and follow-up that's specified when an emergency has taken place. Once we have that, we'll be able to really increase and adjust the services accordingly so that we can give a high-level service that will always be based on what's happening in real time. That's important. It's not just enough to have a policy and work on the basis of that policy. No, we have to be able to adjust it to the reality on the ground. As we've seen, there were several processes that had been established for the wildfires, but last summer the amount of cases had increased so much that, in fact, there was still a lack of resources, not just for ISK, but also in the municipalities themselves and at the provincial government level. Unfortunately, in that specific case, when there was uncertainty about the intensity of these emergencies, we saw there was this need to have a different level of relationships, and I was proud to see that in several communities they took up leadership positions amongst their members. They were in the front line to beat back the fire. And they showed that there was a great deal of strength in the community to make sure that their members were kept safe. There was also a support process underway when they'd had to leave their communities. And there was also a great deal of support extended when people were returning to their communities. Emergencies, it's not just one event, there's several events, and within Indigenous Services Canada, we're there to accompany them in each emergency phase. Thank you very much for that. You now have the floor, MP Lemire. Thank you, and thank you, Minister, for being with us today. you have said that you consider the auditor's report as a good reference point, and you talked about having an action plan 2026 to actually follow up on these points raised by the Auditor General in her follow-up report. Could you please speak a bit more slowly? Yes, should I start again?
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Minister. You stated that the report from the Auditor General was considered as a good reference point and that your department will come up with an action plan report in spring 2026 on the path to be followed to improve these gaps that have been identified by the Auditor General. So first of all, do you agree with the recommendations from the Auditor General? Answer. When you receive a report with recommendations, I take them as a reflection of work that's been done by the Auditor General herself. And also, as we prepare our action plan, we've been able to work with the communities that have been impacted by these recommendations. We know that sometimes one recommendation is very different when it's implemented in one part of the country compared to another part of Canada. We want to work with things that are not reflected in the recommendations. For example, language barriers, distance barriers, things that are not clearly defined yet. And we're going to add them into our action plan so that we can give a response that will cover all of this and reflect all of that and reflect all of these realities. One of the findings in the report is that the spending went up by 84%, going up beyond 13 billion. And in the communities, there's still problems with electricity, drinking water and police services, even though we're now spending 24 billion. And each year in the public accounts, we see sums. It was over 1 billion, which is not actually spent in your budget. So for at one point, it was almost 5 billion that was left on the table. So each year there's nice promises that are given to First Nations. They're not actually delivered on. So why are you not able to spend the money that's allocated to you? Answer. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to address the 84% increase in spending. We have to really look at the overall context of this increase. These are nations and communities that have been chronically underfunded in terms of their needs at varying levels, and also with different spaces and different types of territories, and they all have their different historical context related to their relations with the provincial and federal levels of a government. And also, they've all got different governance structures. And Indigenous Services Canada works with 640 communities, and they've all got these differing realities. We want to try and close the gap, and in order to spend all of the money, I think that's an approach that will put pressure on communities. It has to be clear that in ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, we hand over funding to the communities, but we're not there to make sure that they absolutely spend this. We're there to work with them, collaborate with them, not just to spend things, but to create capacity, to make sure that the programs being delivered are actually meeting the needs that they've determined for their particular nation, and also to set the vision for their future. And to be more flexible in this approach. It's not everyone who's starting from the same point, but everybody wants to get a good outcome that fits into the vision for their nation. But they're not all at the same place, but often Indigenous communities that are poorer in a spiral that maintains them in this situation of poverty because the programs that should lift them out of these difficulties are not actually reaching them. because they don't necessarily have the capacity to meet all the standards that are imposed on them. And I'd like to give you an example in terms of housing initiative that comes from First Nations by and for First Nations set in the communities, Nianchia, and that has not been supported by you in the last budget. Why? Well, thank you for that question. Now, I've already worked with Chef Lance Heyman, and I was very impressed by his program. I know that the Chief Heyman is really stepping up the Nuanchua process, not just to be based in Quebec, but to be able to get a service for clients even at a wider national level. And then with Minister Gregor Robertson, he's the one who's going to give support to these programs. So with that including Nianchia, that initiative, I know that there's going to be a meeting organised to look into this and to look at the potential of Nianchia and also other Indigenous organisations with which we could work on this, because it's important to really establish whether the community wants to set up a process to increase the amount of housing units. We have to ensure that we really work with them to meet their level of needs. And you'll be successful if you invite the community or organisations such as Nianchia or other organisations throughout the country to actually get involved, step in. That's where we've had the most success in government. If we try to have an approach where we set up the programme and we bring it into the community and impose it on them and force them to adjust to meet our aims, that's when things are not going to work. There won't then be a good outcome that reflects their needs. It will create pressure on them. And that's not my approach as a minister. I'm there to work with them and to use different groups and relationships with these organisations that deliver quality services. I believe in Nianchia. I think it's a strength, and I have confidence in Chief Heyman to make sure that in the governmental approach to identify the strategy for this project for urban and rural northern housing, that we can take an approach where we'll draw on and draw in groups from outside to be able to determine the needs within the community. And that depend on groups that have got relationships with other communities. When you do that, I think that's when we're actually going to have more success stories. Thank you very much.
5 minutes. MP Schmel, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. Minister, when the department was created about 6 or so years ago, maybe 7, the department had kind of the mandate that it would put itself out of business one day. And I think that's something that we all support as more and more nations take the path of self-determination and they go at that pace that they feel most comfortable. Having said that, the department itself, as the Auditor General pointed out, has grown in size from about 4,200 employees when it was started to over 8,000 employees. But yet outcomes, as the Auditor General pointed out, only 53% of our recommendations have been achieved at this point. So given the fact that we have more employees than ever, the funding is there, as the Auditor General points out, where is the barriers here to achieving the outcomes?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I can agree that, you know, when I came on in this role as minister, I also supported that there is the objective of Indigenous related files should be ones that respond to self-determination of community to take on responsibility. I think that this is a pathway for success. I also support and honor those communities that are very close and continue to fill those spaces, but I also acknowledge that there are some communities where capacity needs to be built and they need that support because they are not in that space yet. In terms of what we are seeing with increased funding, with increased size of bureaucracy or public service within the department, I want to contextualize it. We when this decision was made to split the department, it was immediately following one of the most challenging times for First Nations people in this country, which was really an era where there was significant reduction of funding, there was a lack of support, there was a lack of real relationship with government. And, I'm really sorry, I don't want to be offensive, but the Conservative government
That's fine.
at
Let's
that
take it up
time
on that.
was
Let's take
really-
your words
I
right
want
there.
to finish answering the
I know,
question.
but you know what? I let you
want
speak
to
for a
finish
minute, and it's
answering
my
the
time.
question because you did
Unfortunately,
ask
Minister,
a portion of the
unfortunately, I
question
have limited
on
time,
bureaucracy.
and I
Well,
understand
I'm
you
I
took up
able
can't, I can't
to
follow
answer the
right now,
question.
so let's just let the minister finish, and then we'll go back to you, and I'll give you a
Do
couple
you
more
pausing
seconds.
the clock?
Yep,
'Cause,
I'm going to give
that
you a
was
few
over
more
a minute,
seconds.
and I think I was more than fair, Chair.
Yeah, we'll give you a couple more seconds, but I'm going to let the minister finish, please.
I do want to answer the entirety of your question. This department has grown in budget. This department has grown in terms of service. This department has grown because it has done a thorough analysis of the entirety of the needs in trying to bring community into a space. There are some communities that need additional support, extended support. There are some communities that have shifted and want to ensure that they're introducing new measures. While you may not agree with the size of the growth of this department, or while you may not agree that it is not, I don't want to say proper spending, because I don't think that that kind of language is necessary in this discussion. It is not reflective of what should be put on the table. It is one where we are required and should morally and should want to, as a government, respond to the needs of First Nations in this country, because they have been harmed historically, even before the Conservative government, where they have responded to historical injustices, where they have responded to instances that they still continue to suffer from the harm that was perpetuated towards them. So I do want to be fair and I do want to be respectful, but I want to ensure that the entirety of the question is responded to in the greater context.
Thank you. MP
I
Chappelle,
will be
continue.
reclaiming my, thank you, Chair. Okay, let's go back on that point where you talked about coming out of 2015. According to the Auditor General, and you can make that claim, that's fine, but no meaningful improvement has been done according to the Auditor General. In housing, it says right here in the paragraph, no meaningful improvement in housing conditions in First Nations communities from 2015 to 2022. Zero meaningful improvement. Despite so the fact that you're sitting here saying, well, it might have been a bad time there, but now it's much better. Well, no, it's not. So the fact that you're saying we're going to give quality services, that's fine. But most nations don't want more services. And you're a respected Indigenous leader yourself. How many times were you talking about new services, new programs, rather than direct funding to nations themselves to make their own self-determination?
Chair, the member is right that the number of employees at ISK as of March 31st was 8,619 FTEs. Also now, with a staffing cap and very prudent staffing decisions, the number is reduced to 8,076 employees. So in fact, the number is actually trending downward. I would just say that. We also have significant results in many areas. In fact, we have a giant placemat here with all kinds of data, outcomes, indicators, and exceptional results that may not have been well reflected in the OAG report, but are outside and with everything else. So we can go through all of those achievements if you'd like, but we probably wouldn't have the time.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Wilson. I appreciate that, and thank you for answering that. But that wasn't my question. Minister Galmasti, the question stands.
Thank you. You might ask the question that there is zero progress, but I do not agree. And I reject the premise of the question because there are many communities across the country that have benefited from the funding programs that existed, that are also reflected in this budget, that are undertaking and developing for themselves new home ownership, movements towards mortgage, movements towards building, ensuring that their community is able to implement and determine what their infrastructure looks like. I've visited many of these communities. I am from a nation that is one of those communities.
So it says here in the Auditor
I'm not able to
General's
understand
report,
where you
the
say there's
percentage of
zero,
homes in need of major
where there is
repairs.
zero progress. We are doing the work to ensure that we are able
Percentage of
to meet
homes in
community
First
in the
Nations
space
communities
that they're in.
that need to be
Hold on.
replaced increased from 5.6% to 6.5%.
Okay, I've added about a minute and 50 seconds, so I'm going to move on, and then we'll have more opportunities to ask questions. So, P.S. Jaime for 5 minutes.
Thank,
We added about almost 2 minutes to that exchange there. The clerk was keeping time.
I had 1:40. So if
The clerk, that's the clerk's time, so, yeah. It was 1:50 something, so. We're just,
True. I
we're
didn't
gonna
know
move
it was-
on and
Yeah.
we'll get back.
Oh, correct. You're about owed that much time. Yeah.
Did you give me that?
There's another round of questions for the Conservatives. Thank you. So Jaime, please.
For the
Thank you.
thank you for joining us here today, Minister. I know you had a really busy week last week with the several First Nations all across Canada coming to Ottawa for the AFN Annual General Assembly, and I'm sure it was something for them to see an actual Minister of Indigenous Services Canada with a lived experience of being First Nations, but also being a leader herself at one point. And I'm sure that they talked to you a lot about the different priorities that they had. And you had mentioned in your opening statement that we're developing an action plan to better address some of the things moving forward. I'm wondering if you could share with us some of the concerns you heard and what our government is doing to move forward with the action plan in contemplation of what they had said.
Thank you, MP Batiste. Last week was an exceptional week for me. I had the opportunity to meet with many of the people that we are serving. In addition, I was able to also meet with some of the new young and emerging leaders, youth that are filling this space, and I was really proud to see them participating at the AFN Assembly, making statements, advocating for youth needs. We heard three things. We really wanted to ensure that when we met with partners that we were able to identify with them what the budget was going to offer. We heard a lot of concerns with what was going on with water legislation. We heard enormous feedback in terms of being really happy that the Prime Minister was there to speak to the tabling of that legislation in the spring. We heard a lot of discussion around housing, and I'm sure I will be asked a question, so I'll save that portion of the response for your colleague who will continue with housing later. But I heard a lot of feedback in terms of the statements made by the Prime Minister with regards to what he wanted to do to protect First Nations in this period of time where we are under great pressure economically. We also heard that there was a lot of anticipation of what the transformation will look like at ISK. We have been working and actively engaging with partners to frame how we want to transition at ISK. It's not only about trying to ensure we are offering a better quality service, it's about also transforming and modernizing within ISK. We underwent the comprehensive review process. We were able to identify areas where we could offer that. We were able to identify areas where we could augment. I'll ask my deputy to speak to some of the modernization and some of the action plan that we're looking to present later on.
I'll be brief. So very proud that ISK has recently reorganized many of its sectors and its operations and programs, more focused, more streamlined, clear accountabilities, but also, as the Minister referred to, a one-window service, so better services to individuals and First Nations by mail, by person, in person, by phone, etc. We're further reorganizing in regional offices to provide better services, again, to First Nation communities and individuals, but also to bring more technologies and more innovations in technology and more automated services. So thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, so last night there was a National Friendship Center reception. I know that some of us attended that in this room. I'm myself from a First Nations reserve, but I do understand the importance of urban locations like the Friendship Centers. There is some concerns from the Friendship Centers being discussed, but I'm wondering if you could speak to how are we prioritizing and recognizing urban supports for Indigenous people in this country?
Thank you. I was very pleased to meet the new leadership at the Friendship Center. I was really happy to also speak with the executive director. Clearly, they are looking for that continuity, that consistency in funding so that they can ensure that they are always reaching the objective of serving those people who live off community. And that is a reality. There are some people who are leaving community. There are some people who wish to, be in city centers to go to school or work. And there is that need for that space to come together as community, and these are critical spaces. I'm looking to ensure that when we have the follow-up dialogue of what the outcomes are going to look like for that continued funding, it is framed and coming from them. So we had the opportunity for an exchange. I'll ask for a technical follow-up in addition to what I've said, but I'm really encouraged with what I saw and the conversations that we had.
Thank you very much, and if you could just follow up in writing, that would be great.
No
We're at the end. Now we have MP Lemire for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, Madam Minister. The Auditor General stated that on the 1st of April 2025, there were still 35 boil water advisories for the long term, and it then went up to the 38th on the 1st of December 2025. And 9 of them have lived under this type of advisory for over a decade. For example, the community of Saki in your riding, where the solution came from Quebec, they're the ones who invested the money for electrification purposes. And Indigenous Services Canada was not able to determine the funding amount that was actually needed for the First Nations to run and maintain their drinking water system. So how can your department say that it's making significant progress? And that's what you said in your response to the report from the Auditor General, if you haven't actually established the basic funding needs that are needed for the safe maintenance and operation of these water systems.
Okay. Merci. Merci, Sébastien. Je voulais juste...
Thank you, Sébastien. Just wanted to clarify one part of your question. Yes, there's still 35 boil water advisories and 9 new ones, and 9 that have been there for over 10 years. But in this process of looking at these 35, it's for different needs. Some of them, they don't have the capacity. They don't have anyone to work with the equipment. No, my question was, how do you actually evaluate their needs as a department? How can you not actually put figures on the real needs so that everyone can have access to drinking water? Well, as I was saying in my answer, the reasons for the boil water advisories are different ones, and that's where we see the different needs. In certain cases, they need a new person who can work in this role or new equipment. What about the others? And that's when we'll be able to set the amounts that need to be allocated and see how we can respond to this. So your amount, sorry, I don't have time, Madam Minister. So your amount for 2025, the government has given $0 for 2025, 2026, and $2.3 billion as of next year only. So the capacity to respond from the government, well, the response seems to be that it's just a dead letter. And that's the end of my time.
In writing.
In writing, okay.
Merci. Okay, so the Conservatives, we have MP Morin first off for 5 minutes, and I believe you're sharing time.
MP Schmale.
MP
Minister,
Schmale.
you introduced Bill S2 into the House today, and you've been doing some consultations on it. You are doing an advisory process, but being from Alberta myself, I heard directly from the Alberta chiefs that they're feeling left out in multiple processes. Last week, the Prime Minister walked out on them when it came to answering questions directly on the Assembly floor. Other First Nations said there was a private meeting with the Prime Minister from Alberta, and many of them were left out. On S2, you have an Indigenous organizations table, Assembly of BC First Nations, Assembly of First Nations Manitoba, Assembly of First Nations National. There is no Alberta First Nations here, and they are feeling quite left out. Why is the government leaving out Alberta Treaty 6, 7, and 8 First Nations when it comes to consultation on major projects of the definition of what a First Nations person is?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we did see S2 come to the House and be introduced today. The invite to the Prime Minister and the time allocated to him to speak is determined by the Assembly of First Nations. I won't comment on how that time was allocated or used. What we did hear from Assembly was many things. There were some communities that really wanted to ensure that we were able to. I heard.
They're feeling left out.
I heard and received from the Alberta First Nation specifically a letter that they wanted to participate, that they wanted to participate on a consultation process that was identified and defined by them. I was able to have some good conversation with some of the leadership there during the treaty table that we have with Alberta First Nations, which I'm going to finish responding, which they had clearly identified that while they were supportive to what a one-parent rule looked like, they also wanted to determine for themselves what membership and citizenship looked like. So my role as a minister is to try to find the space and how we can bridge those things. I want to be sure that it is well understood that I do want to address second generation cutoff. This was one of the big concerns that I heard last
Chair,
week.
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm good.
Nope, to me.
MP Schmale, yes, and you have 2.5 minutes.
You had to think about that, so it's
2.5
a little
minutes,
concern there.
though.
I
He
thought we
split-
knew each other well enough,
He
but
split,
that's
he
okay.
split that perfectly in half. You have 2.5
perfect.
minutes.
All right. Thank you, Minister. Do you agree with the findings of the Auditor General?
As I have already stated earlier, I think that I'm receiving the Auditor General's recommendations, and my response to those recommendations is to ensure that I'm using them as a guide, but also doing the additional work of working with community to see what that recommendation looks like if it is applied in their community. What is the reality of that? So while I want to acknowledge that the Auditor General does immense work, while I want to acknowledge that she gives recommendations that are based from an assessment point of
Have
view,
not got any better?
it is my goal and objective as
do you
minister
agree?
to ensure that if those recommendations are implemented, they also align with what communities want
I
to see
get all that, absolutely.
in their community.
But at the same time, do you agree with the, yes or no, do you agree with the AG's recommendations?
Did you not understand my response?
Yeah,
My
I did.
response
just
was
would like
I
you
have
said you
received,
accept it.
I have received
You
the
accept,
Auditor
you
General's
received it. So that's not a yes or a
recommendation.
no. Do you-
It's
do
not
you
a
agree
yes
with
or
it?
no question.
Yes, I'm pretty sure it is.
It
Okay,
is
let's not do the back and forth. Let's just let the minister answer and keep on with questions. Go ahead, Minister.
While I want to respect the work of the Auditor General, I also want to acknowledge that looking through a lens of compliance with outcomes is one aspect of the work that we do at Indigenous Services Canada. And while the recommendations I think that she is putting forward are made with the best intent for a successful outcome, I also have to reflect that they are not recommendations that would align with the reality of all First Nations communities in the same way. So there is additional work
With
that has to be
So
undertaken
are the
and
majority of
adjusted to
First
reflect
Nations that you're
reality.
talking or
And I
speaking
want to
with
clarify
want
with
more
you
programs?
that it is important
Do they
for
want
us.
more programs? Is that what they're asking for?
It
more
is important
programs?
for us at Indigenous
Or are they asking for
Services.
direct funding?
It
in
is
an
important
agency
for us
So
at
was that point
Indigenous
out?
whose
Services
mandate
Canada
is to
work with.
shut itself down?
Point of order, please. Point of order.
Tough on the interpreters. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. So please go ahead, Minister, and I've added a couple more
I know
seconds.
the minister's job is to eat my time up. I totally understand that, but I'm not going
Let's be
to
respectful
allow her
of
to
the
do that.
interpreters,
I will give
though.
her as much time as I can. Chair.
Merci,
It's
merci.
really a respectful
No, we don't need a
comment
back.
to
We
make to
don't
me,
need a back and forth.
And I would like if you could apologize because I am trying to answer your
I don't
continued
feel you
interruptions
are. I don't
and
feel
your
you are.
continued disrespect for my
MP Schmale,
response
let's
just
are
let the
not
minister
ones
finish.
that
I'm
are
just asking
making a
questions.
productive conversation.
We're
I
gonna let-
can get you don't like the questions. I get that, but I'm asking
MP
the question.
Schmale,
You might not like
MP
my
Schmale,
response,
let's
but I
let-
still have to answer.
Okay, we're going to let the minister answer the question, and then we're going to move on. So please just finish up 30 seconds.
While there are some communities that are prepared to receive direct funding, we are able to work with them in that space. While there are some communities that need additional support and wish to build capacity and want to work with us, we are able to meet them in that space. So when the Auditor General gives me one recommendation to apply, I have to make sure that in application, I am meeting everybody's needs. I want to be fair. I want to treat people well. I want to ensure that they are self-determining in the outcome in addition, because I'm not here to force one recommendation on community. I'm here to support them. And I want to ensure that the Auditor General, while she sees I do my work, also understands that sometimes the reality in one community to another can be quite different. And we as government have to meet those communities in that place.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. And now we
come on.
have Parliamentary Secretary Jaime, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, extra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I know you were kind of cut off during your time of talking about S2 and what you were hearing and what your position is on this. I know we've had many good conversation about the need for the second generation cutoff to be removed. Of course, the difficult question that we grapple with across this country is how do we remove it and what do we replace it with? And how do we ensure that communities, whether they want it or not, have the ability to have a say in their own membership of who decides who's a member of their communities and who decides who's a status Indian. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your thought process on this and our government's, what are our next steps in looking at S2?
Thank you, MP Baptiste. You know, it's important that when you're looking at the conversations that are happening at the Assembly, there are so many different perspectives. I had some caucuses, you know, very supportive of transitioning immediately to a one-parent solution for status. I had some that expressed their concerns in cases where it was not clear if somebody had married into status or if somebody had been adopted through status, if they would have to, with immediacy, receive that solution. For me, in all of my program and service delivery, I am always trying to be respectful of where community is. Where are they in terms of trying to define or determine what their membership code or protocol or citizenship code is? I believe that it is our work at government to move out of the space of determining somebody's First Nation status and really work with community to define a pathway so that they can be self-determining in that space. While it is very challenging to be the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, it is extremely challenging to have to work with the Indian Act as a guide. And I come from the lens and I come from the belief that we should create space to move away from it and empower community to determine for themselves and work with them in a way that's respectful. I also think that there is a lot of opportunity in this space for community to redefine what solution looks like. And while there is an amendment in S2 that offers one parent status as a solution, I do think that we have to go beyond that scope. And that means going beyond the scope to ensure that you're creating space for community to define for themselves. You know, the component of what the Indian Act identifies as status is one aspect of the discussion. The component of what membership means and how you bring new members into community or identify those members that are part of community but were denied service or denied programming in the space of living in community. These are all challenging things. These are all really harsh realities that you have to speak to. That's why I think creating that space and working with community in what they are looking to determine for themselves is the right path forward. First Nations know what's best for themselves. We don't have to come from a place of telling them, especially when the lens that government has used historically is the Indian Act. I don't think that's of any benefit.
Minister, and I don't know how much time I have left, but I would like just a little bit? Okay, well then I will just end with this and compliment you on your very beautiful earrings that you have that have a lot of bling. I've talked to you and told you that my sister actually sells beads all across Canada, Sunday Lace Creation. It's her birthday today, so I want to say happy birthday, Mariah. Keep doing the good work.
All right, well, thank you very much, Chimigwich, and happy birthday. And Minister, thank you so much for meeting the ask of the motion and appearing before Christmas, the holiday break. So I wish you the best and staff the best as well. So Chimigwich. And I'm going to suspend for a bit while we change to the auditor. Welcome back. Right now, we have the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada. Welcome, Karen. And Glenn Wheeler, Principal at the Office of the Auditor General. You have 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to appear before the committee to discuss a report concerning follow-up on the First Nations programs, which was tabled on 21st of October. I would first like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am grateful for the contribution and stewardship of Indigenous peoples right across Canada who have cared for the lands they inhabit for generations. I'm joined today by Glenn Wheeler, the Principal Director responsible for this audit. Programs for First Nations have been a long-standing concern for my office. In this follow-up audit, we examined the progress made by Indigenous Services Canada in implementing 34 recommendations from the 6 audits conducted by my office since 2015. These audits focused on various programs that are important to the health and well-being of First Nations communities, including programs that provide access to primary health care, emergency management services, and safe drinking water. These audits address aspects that most Canadians take for granted. Although program spending has nearly doubled over the past 5 years, we found that Indigenous Services Canada had made unsatisfactory progress on more than half of our previous recommendations.
As early as 2005, we identified concerns with drinking water quality in First Nations communities. Although the number of long-term drinking water advisories has diminished since our 2021 audit of access to safe drinking water in First Nations communities, we are greatly concerned that 9 advisories have remained in effect for a decade or longer. Similarly, we also recommended in 2013 and again in 2022 that the department establish agreements to ensure that all First Nations communities have access to emergency services. In this follow-up audit, we found that even fewer emergency service agreements were in place than in 2022. These agreements are essential for timely, coordinated response to events such as wildfires and floods, while mitigating the disruption to people's lives and the damage to critical infrastructure. Reflecting on our audit findings as well as decades of audit reports on Indigenous matters, we have identified 4 barriers that, in our opinion, hindered the implementation of our recommendations. Lack of sustained management attention, lack of clarity around service levels, insufficient support to bolster First Nations capacity to deliver programs, and a passive and siloed approach to supporting First Nations. One thing is clear: the public service has to do a better job in working with First Nations to make meaningful progress on these long-standing issues that have spanned successive governments and impact multiple generations. In my view, this will require a different approach and mindset. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions committee members may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, AG Hogan. And first off, for 6 minutes, the Conservatives, we have MP Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the recognition, and thank you to the Auditor General for being here. You spoke about the department making unsatisfactory progress on these recommendations over half of the time. That is a question I put to the minister a couple weeks ago, actually, when she was at committee, and she straight up disagreed with that assessment. So I guess you confirmed that in your opening remarks, so I'm wondering if you can expand more on what you found in your report on that, just to make sure that it's clear to everybody.
So I want to be clear by starting off with, we did choose a binary decision. It was either satisfactory or unsatisfactory, so that we could really draw a line in the sand and say whether or not we felt meaningful progress had occurred to address our recommendations. Unsatisfactory does not mean that nothing happened. There was progress in many areas, but what we felt was that the outcome had not been achieved. So an example would be if we made a recommendation to consult with groups or communities and then implement something, while the consultation may have happened, the action of implementing something did not, and we would have deemed that to be unsatisfactory, because in the end, that was the outcome that the recommendation was meant to achieve. So I do acknowledge that there's been lots of consultation and lots of activity, especially around drinking water. There was a big reduction in long-term drinking water advisories, but in my opinion, one is too many, especially if it's been a community that has had it for multiple decades. Drinking water is a basic necessity, and I will always say that it's been unsatisfactory until all of those long-term drinking water advisories have been lifted. Those were commitments made by the government to do so, and that deadline has come and gone.
I definitely agree with you on the drinking water. In northwestern Ontario, the region I'm from, is one of the regions that there are quite a few drinking water advisories that remain. A number of which are long-term, and I do want to ask about that as well, because where I live in Kenora, in town, we occasionally have a drinking water advisory, lasts maybe a day. Things malfunction, it happens, and I think that that's expected across the country in all jurisdictions. But when you see a long-term advisory that goes on for decades, obviously there are greater structural challenges at play there. So I'm wondering if you could speak to your findings over the years on what has led to those long-term advisories specifically remaining in place.
So you're going to take me back to a report we did a while ago, and I will turn to Glenn in case he wants to jump in on this. I mean, I think there's many elements that contribute to a long-term drinking water advisory, and what I think is important to also note is that while there was priority placed on lifting those, that meant an advisory existed 365 days or consecutive days or more. There are many that exist that lasted just a little less, and then there was few days, and then a new one came about. So it even underestimates some of the communities that have had really a long-term impact by having these drinking water advisories. I would tell you it's a few things. It could be the water treatment plant isn't operating properly. It could be that they don't have someone to actually operate it. They don't have the skills or expertise in the area. So there is an assessment done, and when something is deemed to be of poor health, and that's done by the First Nations community in conjunction with the department, that's when a drinking water advisory is put in place. So communities decide when it should be lifted or placed. And there are many elements, unfortunately. So I don't know, Glenn, if you wanted to add anything to that?
Maybe just to add, Auditor General, one point. The whole issue of, funding formula not being amended to take into consideration the state of drinking water system. So if you've got an older system, it's obviously going to take more O&M money to keep it up and running. And although the department went from funding 80% of the cost of water treatment plants to 100%, which was a good thing, the funding formula was not updated to take into consideration the age of the treatment plant. So that's another issue that is of some importance. And the Auditor General mentioned the issue, for example, of water treatment operators. You need a primary and a secondary, and there's turnover, there's retirements, people leave the community. So you might have 2 water treatment operators at one point, but 6 months later you're down to 1, and then you're going to have accompanying issues. So there's a lot that goes into the issue.
Appreciate those responses. Thank you. I think there's about a minute left, Chair. I'm going to give that to Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you. As a CPA, I usually like to look at the balance between what's overhead versus outcomes and what actually turns out to be your findings. Can you maybe focus on the mechanisms that failed when you're looking at ensuring the process? So is it Is it the bureaucracy? Is it not getting programs up and running? Is it not getting money out to the First Nations that need it in the specific areas? Or is it the being bogged down in the process instead of actually getting money out there?
25 seconds.
Okay, well, I'm going to try really quickly and answer that. It's a tough one to answer because it really will depend. At times, it's about negotiation with provinces or other levels of government in addition to the First Nations community. At times, it's money. At times, it's capacity. There's so many factors that in 25 seconds, I think I would tell you it depends.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Parliamentary Secretary Hanley, please. Go ahead.
Thank you for being here, and thanks for the reports, and also thank you for the, I guess, the report on the reports, because tracking progress is so important. And I think you explained somewhat the, kind of a binary. It's like a binary report card. It's unsatisfactory or satisfactory, and yet you recognize even within unsatisfactory, there's progress. One of the areas I'm interested in is, when I look at emergency services or health services, the context has changed, I would say, in both of those areas quite dramatically in the last few years. Emergency services, we know that wildfire risk has increased, for instance, dramatically. We know in provision of health services that we're in a workforce crisis nationally in terms of recruiting and retention, even in my area in the Yukon, where it used to be so attractive and easy to retain and recruit. It's equally challenging. So how do you apply the recommendations, recognizing that the changing context, all while kind of giving a binary report card, if you know what I mean?
No, I do absolutely, and I will, turn to Glenn maybe if you want some more details. I think when it comes to, let's look at health services, we would have expected that after studies and assessments had been done, that a step would have made to actually change and improve the health services. So the studies and assessments did a good job of identifying what needed to change. And then that last step wasn't done. So even in a rapidly changing world, when you did that assessment and study, you heard from communities what they wanted and what should change, but then no change occurred. So for us, that would be an unsatisfactory level of progress. But we did see some satisfactory progress when it came to hiring of nurses or finding more creative ways to get to nurses into remote communities. And so there were some that had very satisfactory progress. And that wouldn't have been about just finding new ways. It would have been about actually having increased capacity and increased presence. So there were things done well, but at times, if you just take that first step and don't follow through, is where we would have said unsatisfactory, which is one of our actual barriers, where we talked about sort of a sustained focus from senior management. There is a flurry of activity after our reports, lots of commitments and action plans, and then we see it dissipate over time. But we do see examples, for example, in BC. In fact, I think there was even one in Yukon where that sustained focus actually saw services transition to First Nations community, and that would really be the definition of success in dealing with a recommendation.
So these four barriers in themselves are, as you mentioned, particularly the lack of sustained management attention. The others are equally intriguing, but I have to go to what you concluded with, a different approach and mindset. So maybe you can elaborate on what you see as a different approach and mindset.
Many Auditor Generals before me have talked about this, and the reason I decided to do a follow-up on some of our programs was to mark the middle of my mandate, so that I didn't wait till the end and hear what I hear my predecessors say. So, Sheila Fraser would have said it was unacceptable, the lack of progress. Mike Ferguson, about halfway through his mandate, said it was beyond unacceptable. And I tried to think of a word, and I would tell you that, big words aren't driving the change that's needed. I really think it needs to be something different. And I would point to one of our barriers on the siloed and passive approach as probably the biggest one that I think needs to change. Currently, it is the requirement of all communities to know that a program exists, to have the capacity to apply for it or fill out the paperwork to get access to it. But then it's very granular. If it's drinking water, it's this program. Within drinking water, there are many programs that you might individually have to apply to. Emergency management. If it's about infrastructure, it's a different program than about access to services. So that passive and siloed approach needs to change. Communities who need help, they need to be met where they are to help change them. And right now, the department waits for them to come to the department.
So just, yeah, maybe just to dig into that, because really what you're talking about then to overcome that siloed approach is really to take a more holistic, almost whether you call it intervention or audit, or because I recognize the where capacity of a community can be so stretched with trying to respond to a siloed approach, let alone all the maybe the consultation capacity as well when improvements are trying to be made. So maybe you can highlight where you've seen a success, where you have seen a successful approach that has been maybe more holistic, has overcome some of the siloed.
25 seconds again.
Again.
Very challenging committee with 25-second answers. I guess what I would point to here is probably that if we look at our housing report, and it wasn't a success, but it'll highlight an example, smaller communities had more homes in need of repair or replacement, yet they received a fraction of the available funding because they didn't have the capacity. Meeting them out, going to them and saying, can we help you go through the heavy burden of all of the paperwork and the funding would put them on an equal footing or closer to an equal footing. Currently, it disadvantages disproportionately communities that just don't have capacity.
Thank you very much. And our last question will be from MP Lemire for 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madam Hogan, for being here today. So in the response of the ISC to your report, they said that this does not fully reflect the significant progress that's been made, where 147 advisories have been lifted, as well as 311 temporarily, and also they've increased funding for the operating and maintenance of the plants and also the sustainability of the infrastructure, amongst others. But in your report, you've also pointed out something that's quite troubling, namely ISC hasn't determined the real funding that's actually needed for First Nations to operate and maintain the drinking water systems. There's $0 this year, and there's going to be $2.3 billion that will only start to flow as of next year. So given that context, can you explain how your office reached the conclusion that they have not correctly determined the funding that's needed to run and maintain the water system? Well, there was a lot in that question. Look at the funding mechanism. When we finished our study on or audit on drinking water, I think the system hadn't been updated for 3 decades. It was updated afterwards, after a report came out, but for 3 decades to not actually reflect the fact that it's become more expensive to repair and maintain the water treatment systems and then pay the wages for the operators for the treatment systems. That's gone up as well. The costs have changed. In the north, if we're talking about communities that are far more remote than others, there's different costs implied. So that was the basis of our conclusion that they haven't really adjusted the system. Now, in the meantime, they have had made adjustments to the funding mechanism, but you still have to dedicate money in the budgets to be allocated to supporting communities on this. And since 2015, your reports have had many recommendations to ISC about delivery of programs and health and education services, as well as drinking water services. what have been the main challenges for ISK in the implementation of these recommendations over time? Have you seen certain trends emerging or systemic barriers stopping the complete implementation of your recommendations from taking place, such as the policing services and housing, amongst others? Answer. I think I'll stick to safe drinking water in my answer, but I think that can also be extended and applied to other areas as well. Here, there was a commitment made by the government to lift all of the boiling water advisories, and they set the deadline of the 31st of March 2025. They missed that deadline. There were lots of water advisories that are still in effect, and then they set another deadline, and they missed that as well. So, yes, there has been a great deal of progress made, and I recognise that they had around 60 advisories, 60 water advisories, and they've got down to about 30 now, and this is continuing to evolve. But nevertheless, there are still communities, 9 in particular, where for over a decade they've had these advisories, and one of them, it's almost 3 decades that they've had this water advisory. That's a lot of time to wait to get safe drinking water, isn't it? So it's not just a question of money, it's a different approach. And I'd like to refer you to our 4 barriers, and there's an element in each of these barriers which would explain why these recommendations have not been implemented in a timely fashion. Question. Now, there are certain elements in your report that have said that there are many First Nations communities that are still dealing with these challenges, and there's a question also of their capacity to effectively deliver these programs and services. According to your audits over the last 6 years, have you seen certain trends or recurrent types of challenges experienced in the First Nations communities, the Métis and the Inuit communities as well? Is one of the problems the capacity of ISK to actually help them to overcome these barriers, or is it in fact the fact that they never develop expertise within the Indigenous communities and the deadlines are actually too short with the delivery of services to actually maintain expertise? For example, you could program it only lasts for a year or 2. It's hard to maintain their expertise, rather than if you have a program that stretches over 5 or 10 years. Answer. Obviously, if there's no long-term funding, if the funding's just attached to a short-term program, then that's always a concern. But it's not always a question of money. I'd like to point you to 2 of our barriers. First of all, we have to correctly define the level of service that's required, because then there's a real commitment with the communities to understand what they could expect to receive. And then it's easier for the government to establish the funding level that's needed. So this lack of having these clear definitions in many areas is one element that's a big trend. And we've been mentioning it for years, but it hasn't been resolved. And then obviously the passive and silent approach, and there's insufficient support to actually bolster capacity in the communities. It's not just enough to actually deliver this service, but to rather make the community more autonomous, giving them support so that they can have the capacity and the skills within their community. And often we don't see that approach being pursued. Do you have the capacity to assess whether an act such as the one that was promised by Prime Minister for spring, before we had Bill 61 that we were studying in this committee in the past? And do you think that would actually make this more rigorous or have a better capacity to deploy services to First Nations? Or do you think that the money promised in the budget could have been useful, but in fact there have been certain feelings that cannot be overcome by any bill that could come out in the future? Answer. Well, it's hard to talk about a bill that's not yet been approved. I don't know if that's going to change things, and it's hard to see whether an act is going to lead to changes in the approach used. Commitments have been made over the years, over the decades, in fact, but there hasn't been a changed approach. I really think there has to be this type of sea change. Bring the communities round the table and change the way in which the government supports them to address not just the barriers that we've mentioned, but the other barriers that communities are raising themselves, such as the fact that it's so burdensome to actually have to apply for each pool of funding. It's not just a question of money. The money's going up. And it's not just a question of goodwill. No, it's an approach that has to be different. Thank you.
Thank you to the AG Hogan and Principal Wheeler for your testimony today. We are going to suspend as we need to give drafting instructions to the analysts and the clerk for this study. And again, thank you very much for taking time, and I wish you the best of the season. So we'll suspend, and we're going to come back in committee and give some drafting instructions.